Before we begin, let me ask you this. What would you sacrifice for love? Would you defy the rules that bind you? Risk everything you hold sacred? In this story, we journey into the depths of forbidden desire, where faith collides with passion, and two souls dare to challenge the unchallengeable. Stay with us as we unravel the tale of Sister Beth and Sister Lena. The Church of Saint Aridia stood as a sentinel against the world, its spires piercing the heavens as though seeking to anchor the divine to the earth. Perched atop a jagged cliff, it was more than stone and mortar, it was a fortress of faith, a realm where divine law ruled and human desires were silenced. Or so it was meant to be. Within these walls, Sister Beth had found refuge, or perhaps, confinement. For over 2 decades, she had walked these stone corridors, her every step deliberate, her devotion unquestioned. To those who knew her, Beth was the embodiment of serenity, a woman whose life was woven seamlessly into the fabric of the Church's rituals. Yet beneath her composed exterior lay an ache she dared not name, a yearning that echoed like a hollow bell. It was on a rainy autumn morning that Lena arrived. The storm clung to her as she stepped inside the church, her presence a sudden burst of vitality against the somber quiet. At 27, she was younger than most novices, her hazel eyes alive with questions she had yet to ask. Whispers followed her through the cloister, of a past left behind, of a soul seeking redemption. But Lena carried an energy that refused to be subdued, a spark that seemed to challenge the very air around her. From the moment their paths crossed, Beth noticed her. Perhaps it was the way Lena's nervous movements contrasted with the rigid stillness of the other nuns, or the way her voice, though soft, seemed to carry a quiet defiance. And yet, Beth told herself it was nothing more than curiosity, nothing more than the compassion she had sworn to offer all who entered this sacred space. That evening, as the rain eased into a gentle mist, Beth found herself drawn to the chapel. There, kneeling beneath the dancing flames of a dozen candles, was Lena. Her hands were clasped tightly in prayer, her head bowed, and for a moment, Beth saw not a novice, but a woman carrying the weight of her own battles. Something about the sight struck her, a vulnerability that felt out of place here, in this house of rules and order. Lena looked up. Their eyes met, and the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just a glance, it was a connection, unspoken yet undeniable. Beth's heart skipped, a short-lived second that swept the air from her lungs, terrified, and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. In the holiest of places, love was never meant to bloom. And yet, in that single moment, something took root, a quiet spark that would set their world ablaze. Welcome to my channel, where stories come to life and challenge the boundaries of imagination, faith, and the human experience. Here, we explore captivating tales of love, sacrifice, and the moral dilemmas that shape us all. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will make you think, feel, and reflect. And if you're ready, let's dive into today's powerful narrative. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't forget. The Church of Saint Aridia was a place where time seemed to stand still, where every hour was dictated by the tolling of bells and every action prescribed by ancient rituals. For Lena, it felt like stepping into another world, a world as cold and unyielding as the stone walls that enclosed it. She struggled to adapt. Rising before dawn, long hours of prayer in silence, the monotonous rhythm of chores, these routines pressed down on her, suffocating her restless spirit. She watched the other nuns, their faces serene as they carried out their duties. Lena wondered if she could ever find that peace, or if the spark inside her would always resist the quiet conformity the church demanded. Sister Beth, with her steady gaze and measured steps, seemed the very embodiment of that peace. Her name was often spoken in tones of reverence among the novices, a paragon of discipline and devotion. So when Beth was tasked with mentoring Lena, it was seen as a kindness, a way to guide the newcomer toward the steadiness she seemed to lack. But for Beth, the assignment felt like both a challenge and an awakening. Their interactions began formally, as such things often do. Beth explained the rules of the cloister with practiced precision: when to rise, when to kneel, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Lena listened, nodding dutifully, but her hazel eyes often betrayed her inner turmoil. She asked questions, more questions than Beth had ever heard from a novice. Why must silence be kept during meals? Why were certain prayers repeated so often? Why must the garden, of all places, be tended with such meticulous care? At first, Beth responded with answers drawn from scripture and doctrine, reciting them like a litany. But Lena's questions persisted, unsettling her in ways she couldn't quite explain. For every answer Beth gave, Lena seemed to peel back another layer, exposing not just the rules but the assumptions beneath them. It was disconcerting and, at the same time, strangely invigorating. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the library, Lena broke the silence. "Do you ever miss the world outside?" she asked, her voice low but insistent. Beth paused, her hand hovering over the spine of an old book. She hadn't expected the question, though she knew Lena had been holding it back for days. "I've been here so long," Beth replied carefully, "that the outside world feels like a distant memory. I don't think about it much." Lena tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "That's not an answer," she said. "That's avoidance." Beth stiffened, unsure how to respond. It wasn't just Lena's words, it was the way she said them, with a mixture of curiosity and defiance that both challenged and intrigued her. For a moment, Beth felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, as though Lena had seen something in her that she didn't want to admit even to herself. Over time, their interactions softened. What began as formal mentorship evolved into something warmer, something neither of them could quite define. Lena's questions grew less pointed, more personal, and Beth found herself responding in ways she hadn't expected. She began to share stories, fragments of her own journey into the church, of the struggles she had faced as a young novice. Lena listened intently, her eyes searching Beth's face as if trying to understand not just the words but the woman behind them. It was during one of their evening walks in the garden that the unspoken tension between them came closest to the surface. The air was cool, the scent of roses hovering as they strolled along the cobblestone paths. Lena's usual curiosity had given way to a quiet introspection, and Beth found herself waiting for the question she knew was coming. Finally, Lena stopped and turned to her. "Beth," she said softly, "do you ever feel like you're suffocating here?" Like a ghost, the words hung in the room, their presence impossible to ignore, raw and vulnerable. Beth felt her heart tighten. She wanted to deny it, to offer some reassuring platitude about faith and purpose. But the truth caught in her throat. How could she tell Lena that there were nights when she woke in the darkness, gasping for air as if the weight of her vows was suffocating her? "Sometimes," Beth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that feeling passes. It always passes." Lena's gaze didn't waver. "Does it? Or do we just learn to live with it?" Beth didn't have an answer. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against Lena's shoulder in a gesture meant to comfort but that hovered longer than it should have. The touch sent a jolt through both of them, and Beth quickly withdrew, her cheeks flushing with a heat she hadn't felt in years. Lena smiled faintly, a wisp of sadness trailing through her eyes. "Thank you," she said, though Beth wasn't sure what she was thanking her for. They continued their walk in silence, but the air between them was charged with an energy neither could name. In that garden, under the fading light of the evening, something shifted. It was subtle, a crack in the walls they had both built around themselves. But cracks have a way of spreading, and what began as a delicate moment blossomed into a storm neither could control. Time within the church of St. Eridia moved like a slow, endless tide. Days blurred into weeks, marked only by the tolling of bells and the rhythm of prayer. And yet, for Beth and Lena, something began to shift. What had started as a formal mentorship evolved into a connection that neither of them fully understood, but both felt deeply. Their bond grew quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. It was in the small things, the way Lena would linger a moment longer than necessary after their conversations, or the way Beth's gaze would drift to Lena during meals. They began to seek each other out, drawn together as if by some unseen force. A glance exchanged during morning prayer, a whispered word in the hallway, each interaction added another thread to the delicate web forming between them. At shared meals, Lena's laughter would sometimes break the solemn silence of the dining hall. The other nuns would glance disapprovingly, but Beth couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. In the library, their conversations became less about scripture and more about life, Lena's questions growing bolder, her curiosity unrestrained. Beth found herself answering not as a mentor, but as a companion, a confidant. It was during one of these library conversations that Lena's rebellious nature began to surface. They had been discussing a passage from the Psalms when Lena suddenly closed the book, her expression thoughtful. "Beth," she said, her voice low, "why do we do all this? The prayers, the rituals, it feels so performative sometimes. Do you really think God cares if we kneel or sit, if we say the words just right?" Beth stiffened, her instinct to rebuke rising quickly. But then she saw the sincerity in Lena's eyes, the genuine struggle behind the question. She sighed. "It's not about the actions themselves," Beth replied carefully. "It's about the discipline, the intention behind them. Rituals help us focus our hearts and minds on God. But what if your heart doesn't feel focused?" Lena pressed. "What if it feels trapped?" Beth hesitated. Lena's words hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. "We all have moments of doubt," she said finally. "But it's dangerous to question too openly. Be careful, Lena." Beth's tone was gentle, but Lena caught the warning. She nodded, though the spark of rebellion in her eyes remained. And while Beth's words were meant to caution, they betrayed something else, a spark of admiration for Lena's courage to ask the questions Beth herself had long buried. Late one night, Beth found herself wandering the quiet halls, unable to sleep. Something about the day had unsettled her, a restlessness she couldn't shake. As she passed the library, she noticed the faint glow of candlelight spilling from beneath the heavy wooden door. Curious, she stepped inside. There, sitting at one of the long tables, was Lena. Her head was bowed, her hands gripping a piece of paper tightly. She didn't notice Beth at first, lost in her thoughts. Beth hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. But then Lena let out a soft, shuddering sigh, and Beth's heart clenched. "Lena," she said gently. Lena looked up, startled. Her eyes were red, her face a picture of anguish. Beth moved closer, instinct taking over. "What's wrong?" Beth asked, sitting beside her. For a moment, Lena said nothing, her gaze fixed on the paper in her hands. Finally, she whispered, "It's a letter from my sister. She's struggling, Beth. She needs me, and I'm here, doing what? Tending gardens and reciting prayers while she's out there, alone." Beth reached out without thinking, placing her hand over Lena's. The touch was meant to comfort, but the instant their skin met, it was as if the world around them disappeared. The warmth of Lena's hand, the softness of her skin, it was electric. Time seemed to freeze as they sat there, connected by something neither of them could name. Lena looked up, her eyes searching Beth's. For a moment, Beth thought she might say something, but then reality crashed back in. Beth pulled her hand away, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Lena interrupted, her tone firm but gentle. "Beth, you're the only one who makes me feel like I can breathe." The words hung between them, heavy and charged. Beth's heart thundered like a drum, each beat reverberating through her ribs, her mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the weight of what Lena had just admitted was too much. Without another word, Beth stood and left the library, her footsteps echoing in the silence. That night, Beth lay awake in her small, Spartan room, staring at the ceiling. Lena's words repeated over and over in her mind. "You're the only one who makes me feel like I can breathe." Beth didn't know what to do with that truth, but she couldn't deny it any longer. Something was growing between them, something that defied the rules she had lived by for so long. And in the stillness of the night, Beth realized that she was no longer afraid of it. She was afraid of what would happen if she tried to deny it. Love is a quiet rebellion, a force that defies rules, expectations, and the walls built to contain it. Within the cloistered silence of Saint Eridia, where vows bound every soul to obedience, love was the most forbidden sin of all. And yet, it was here, under the veil of moonlight, that Beth and Lena began to uncover a truth they could no longer deny. It started with a confrontation, but not the kind that shatters. It was the kind that opens doors, that lets in the light, even when it feels blinding. Lena found Beth in the cloister one evening, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. The day's prayers had ended, and the night was thick with stillness. But Lena carried within her a storm, one that had brewed for weeks and could no longer be contained. "Beth," Lena said, her voice soft but trembling with urgency. "I need to talk to you." Beth turned, surprised by the intensity in Lena's tone. She had been standing near the stone archways, gazing out at the shadows of the garden. Her heart quickened as she saw the look in Lena's eyes, vulnerability mixed with determination. It was a look she had come to recognize, one that always left her unsettled. "What is it, Lena?" Beth asked, her voice steady but her pulse unsteady. Lena hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer, her hands clasped in front of her as if holding herself together. "I can't keep pretending," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Not with you. Not anymore." Beth froze, her breath catching. She knew, instinctively, what Lena meant, but she wasn't ready to hear it. Not here, not now. "Lena, I don't understand," she said, though her voice betrayed her. She understood perfectly. "Yes, you do," Lena replied, her tone almost pleading. "You feel it too. I know you do." The silence that followed was unbearable. Beth opened her mouth to respond, but the words she needed wouldn't come. She wanted to deny it, to tell Lena she was wrong. But denial felt like a lie, and Beth had lived her life in the pursuit of truth, no matter how difficult. "We've taken vows," Beth said finally, her voice breaking. "Vows to God, to the church. This, whatever this is, it can't happen." "Why not?" Lena asked, her voice rising. "Because some rule says so? Because someone decided that love is a sin? Beth, why would God give us the capacity to feel this, to love this deeply, if it's meant to be denied?" Beth's determination started to falter, her confidence slipping away. Lena's words were a mirror, reflecting all the questions she had buried for years. She turned away, gripping the edge of the stone railing as if to steady herself. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "It can't be." Lena took another step closer, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It is that simple. Love is not the sin, Beth. Hiding from it, hiding from ourselves, that's the sin." Beth felt the weight of Lena's words settle over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. Before she could stop herself, she turned to face Lena, and in that moment, all the walls she had built around her heart began to crack. "Lena, please," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was asking her to stop or to stay. Lena stepped closer still, her face inches from Beth's. "I'm not asking for much," she said, her voice trembling. "Just this." And then, before Beth could say another word, Lena leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than an answer. But when Beth didn't pull away, it deepened, the weight of weeks, months of unspoken longing spilling into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their faces inches apart. "This is wrong," Beth said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Does it feel wrong?" Lena asked, her gaze steady. Beth couldn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, her mind a whirlwind of emotion. "I need to think," she said, and she walked away, leaving Lena standing alone in the moonlit cloister. But thinking didn't bring clarity. In the days that followed, Beth wrestled with herself, her faith, and her feelings. She spent hours in prayer, begging for guidance, for the strength to resist. But the answers she sought didn't come. The silence of the chapel only amplified the sound of Lena's voice in her mind, her questions echoing louder than any hymn. Despite her inner conflict, Beth found herself drawn to Lena again and again. They began to steal moments together, brief, ephemeral encounters in the garden, whispered conversations in the chapel. They were careful, but not careful enough. Their bond was growing, impossible to ignore. One night, as they sat together in the garden, Lena spoke the words that had been on Beth's mind since the beginning. "You're torn, aren't you?" Lena said, her voice gentle but firm. "Between me and the church." Beth nodded, unable to speak. Lena reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Beth, I'm not asking you to choose. I'm just asking you to stop fighting what you already know is true." Beth looked at Lena, her heart aching with the weight of her decision. She didn't have an answer, not yet. But as she sat there, her hand in Lena's, she realized one thing: whatever path she chose, it would change her life forever. In the quiet of the night, with the garden as their witness, Beth and Lena began a love that was as forbidden as it was undeniable. It was a love that would test their faith, their courage, and the very foundation of everything they had believed. In a place governed by silence, whispers are louder than words. Within the walls of St. Eridia, secrets had a way of surfacing, slipping through cracks like water through stone. Beth and Lena had fought to keep their love hidden, but the weight of it, the sheer force of their connection, was becoming impossible to contain. The change had been gradual but unmistakable. Beth, once the picture of stoic devotion, now seemed distracted during prayers, her eyes straying to Lena more often than they should. Lena, who had always struggled with the rules, now carried herself with a new confidence, as if she had found something worth defying the world for. And the other nuns noticed. Suspicious glances followed them in the corridors. Conversations quieted when they entered a room, only to resume in hushed tones after they passed. It was only a matter of time before someone confronted them, or worse, reported them. Lena, as always, was the first to break the silence. They were sitting in the garden one evening. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though the very air itself had absorbed the weight of what remained unsaid. Beth had been unusually quiet, her brow furrowed as she picked at the hem of her robe. Lena watched her for a moment before speaking. "Beth," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We can't keep living like this." Beth looked up, her heart sinking. She knew what Lena meant, and she dreaded where the conversation was headed. "What choice do we have?" she asked, her voice weary. "If we're discovered." "We've already been discovered," Lena interrupted. "They're not fools. They see the way we look at each other, the way we..." She broke off, her frustration evident. "We're only fooling ourselves if we think we can keep this a secret." Beth closed her eyes, the truth of Lena's words cutting deep. "So what do we do?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We tell Father Michael," Lena said, her tone resolute. Beth's eyes snapped open, panic flashing across her face. "Lena, no. It's the only way," Lena said firmly. "He's the one person who might understand. And if he doesn't, at least we'll know where we stand." Beth shook her head, a tightness spread through her chest, fear constricting her like an invisible cage. The idea of confessing their love, to anyone, felt like stepping off a cliff. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "If he condemns us, if we do nothing," Lena interrupted, her voice rising, "then what are we? Hiding in the shadows, living in fear?" "Beth, this isn't just about us. This is about what's right. And love," she paused, her voice softening. "Love is right. No matter what anyone says." Beth stared at Lena, her heart torn between fear and admiration. She wanted to argue, to point out all the risks, but deep down, she knew Lena was right. Hiding had become unbearable. They couldn't go on like this. Finally, with a deep, trembling breath, Beth nodded. "Okay," she said. "We'll tell him." The next evening, they approached Father Michael's chambers. The walk to his door felt endless, each step heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. When they finally reached it, Beth hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. Lena placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Together, Lena whispered. Beth nodded, and they knocked. Father Michael's voice called out from within, calm and measured as always. Come in. They entered, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding. Father Michael sat at his desk, his expression kind but curious. Sisters, he said, gesturing for them to sit. What brings you here? Beth and Lena exchanged a glance, the weight of their secret pressing down on them. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Father, we have something to confess. Father Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but attentive. Go on, he said. Lena hesitated, her courage faltering for the first time. Beth, sensing her struggle, reached out and took her hand. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. Taking a deep breath, Beth found her voice. It's about us, she said, her voice trembling. About love. The air seemed to freeze, the weight of the words sinking into the space between them, heavy and charged. Father Michael didn't react immediately, his gaze shifting between the two women. What do you mean? He asked gently. Lena took over, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. We love each other, Father. Not as sisters in Christ, but as something more. She paused, her eyes glistening. We know what the church teaches, what our vows mean. But this doesn't feel like a sin. It feels holy. It feels right. Beth nodded, tears streaming down her face. We're not asking for permission, she said, her voice cracking. We can't live with the hiding anymore. If you need to condemn us, we understand. But we had to tell you the truth. Father Michael sat quietly, his hands folded on the desk before him. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing against Beth and Lena like a tangible weight. Their words, spoken with courage, trembling but raw, now hung in the air, waiting for a response. Each beat of Beth's heart hit like a sledgehammer, relentless and deafening, her mind racing with the possibilities. Would he rebuke them? Condemn them? Report them to the church's higher authorities? The uncertainty was a chasm beneath their feet, and with each second of silence, they felt themselves teetering closer to the edge. When Father Michael finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, a stark contrast to the chaos in their minds. You've given me much to think about, he said slowly. His gaze rested on them, not with judgment, but with something more complicated. Compassion, perhaps. Curiosity, certainly. But there was no anger, no trace of the condemnation they had feared. Beth couldn't hold back. Father, if you believe we've betrayed our vows, we'll accept whatever punishment you deem necessary. But we needed you to know the truth. Hiding us, it's unbearable. Her voice cracked, the weight of their secret spilling out in her words. Lena placed a hand on Beth's, steadying her. We've tried to deny it, she added, her tone more resolute. We've prayed, we've fought against it, but this love, it's not something we can turn away from. It feels sacred, not sinful. And if that's wrong, she trailed off, her courage faltering. If that's wrong, then I don't know what's right anymore. Father Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered their words. Love, he said finally, his voice soft but firm, is perhaps the most misunderstood of God's gifts. The church has long sought to define it, to contain it within rules and vows. But love, true love, resists containment. Beth's breath hitched. This wasn't the response she had expected. She glanced at Lena, who was watching Father Michael with wide eyes, hope glimmering in their depths. Father, Lena asked cautiously, are you saying, you don't think this is wrong? He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sisters, he began, there is a difference between breaking vows and breaking faith. Chastity is not the absence of love, but the purity of it. It is not about denying your heart but about aligning it with God's will. Tell me, does this love of yours lead you to selfishness? To harm? Or does it inspire you to become better, to grow closer to God? Neither Beth nor Lena spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence was answer enough. Father Michael nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. If your love is pure, if it is rooted in a desire to honor God and one another, then who am I to call it sin? Tears welled in Beth's eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she bowed her head. Lena, overcome with relief, let out a soft, trembling laugh. They had come expecting judgment, and instead, they had been met with understanding. Father Michael stood, his presence commanding but not intimidating. There is a risk in what you ask of me, he said. Not all would see this as I do. But love, true love, deserves to be recognized, not hidden away in fear. What does that mean? Beth asked hesitantly, her voice barely audible. Father Michael's smile widened slightly. It means, he said, that I would like to bless your union. Privately, of course. But if you truly believe that your love is a gift from God, then it is my duty to honor it. For a moment, neither Beth nor Lena could speak. The enormity of his words washed over them, leaving them breathless. Lena was the first to find her voice. You would do that for us? It is not for you, Father Michael corrected gently. It is for God. And for the love He has placed between you. The ceremony was quiet, intimate, and profoundly sacred. It took place that very night in the small side chapel, away from prying eyes. The air was heavy with incense, the quivering of candlelight casting soft shadows on the stone walls. Father Michael stood before them, his hands resting lightly on the open Bible before him. Love is patient, he began, his voice steady. Love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. The familiar words from Corinthians carried a new weight, a deeper meaning as they echoed through the chapel. Beth and Lena stood side by side, their hands clasped, their hearts full. When Father Michael extended his hands over them, his blessing was quiet but profound. May your love be a testament to the boundless grace of God, he said. May it guide you, strengthen you, and draw you closer to Him. For love, in its truest form, is divine. When it was over, Beth and Lena knelt before him, their heads bowed in reverence. Father Michael placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his voice soft. Go forth with courage, he said. For the world will not always understand. But God sees your hearts, and that is enough. As they rose, their hands still entwined, Beth felt something she hadn't felt in years, peace. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that their love was not a burden, but a blessing. In the quiet of that sacred space, under the watchful eyes of the divine, their love was no longer a secret. It was sanctified. Secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how carefully they are guarded. The blessing of Beth and Lena's union, though conducted in private, did not remain so for long. In a place like St. Aridia, where silence reigned but whispers thrived, the truth was a fire that spread quickly through the cloistered halls, igniting scandal at every turn. It began with murmurs. A passing remark overheard by a vigilant nun. A fleeting yet charged glance exchanged between Beth and Lena during morning prayer. Suspicion turned to inquiry, and inquiry turned to outrage. When the truth reached the higher clergy, it was not met with understanding but with fury, their judgment swift and unyielding. A blessing, one bishop had reportedly exclaimed, his voice filled with incredulity. This is not love, it is heresy. It defiles the sanctity of the vows they swore. Letters were dispatched to Father Michael, summoning him to account for his actions. Beth and Lena were not spared, their names spoken with disdain in the chambers of power. For the Church, this was not merely a breach of conduct, it was an affront to the very foundation of their beliefs. The day the summons arrived, the atmosphere at St. Aridia was suffocating. Beth and Lena could feel the shift, the avoidance in the eyes of the other nuns, the coldness in their greetings. The isolation was immediate and absolute, as if the world they had known for so long had turned against them. Father Michael called them to his chambers that evening. His face, usually calm and composed, was etched with lines of weariness. "They know," he said simply, his voice heavy. "The higher clergy has demanded answers." Lena straightened her back, her defiance unbroken. "Then we'll give them answers," she said. "We'll tell them what this is, what it means." Father Michael gave her a sad smile. "You're brave, Lena. But you must understand, they don't want answers. They want obedience. And they've given me a choice: renounce what I've done or step down from my position." Beth's breath caught. "Step down?" she asked, her voice trembling. "But you've done nothing wrong." "To them, I have," Father Michael said. "And so have you." He hesitated before continuing. "They've given you the same choice. End your relationship, publicly repent, and remain within the monastery. Or leave, together." The room fell silent. Beth and Lena exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the weight of the decision before them. It wasn't just a choice between love and duty, it was a choice between two versions of themselves. The women they had been and the women they were becoming. That night, Beth sat alone in the chapel, her head bowed in prayer. But the words wouldn't come. For years, she had found solace in the rituals of faith, in the quiet certainty of her devotion. Now, her faith felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning with no clear path forward. Lena found her there, slipping into the pew beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena reached out, her hand covering Beth's. "We can't stay," she said quietly. "Not like this." Beth turned to her, tears brimming in her eyes. "But where will we go? What will we do?" "We'll figure it out," Lena said, her voice steady. "We'll leave this place, but we won't leave our faith. We'll carry it with us, Beth. And we'll carry each other." In that moment, Beth felt a strange peace settle over her. It wasn't the certainty she had once known, but it was enough. She nodded, squeezing Lena's hand. "Then let's go," she said. The next morning, as the sun rose over St. Aridia, Beth and Lena packed their few belongings. The monastery was quiet, an unarticulated tension saturated the space, almost tangible. As they made their way to the gates, heads turned. Some watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Whispers weaved through the crowd, each thread tangled with quiet scorn. When they reached the gates, they paused. Beth turned to look back at the monastery one last time, her heart heavy with both grief and relief. She had given so much of her life to this place, but now it was time to leave it behind. "Are you ready?" Lena asked, her voice gentle. Beth took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Hand in hand, they stepped through the gates and into the world beyond. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time, they felt free. Free to love, free to live, free to be exactly who they were. The scandal of Beth and Lena's departure rippled far beyond the walls of St. Aridia. The church denounced them, and Father Michael, true to his word, resigned his position rather than betray his principles. But even as their names were spoken with scorn in some circles, they were whispered with admiration in others. Their story became a quiet rebellion, a testament to the power of love to defy even the most rigid of structures. And as Beth and Lena walked hand in hand into an uncertain future, they carried with them the knowledge that their love, though forbidden, was sacred. It was not bound by rules or walls, but by something far greater. And in the end, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more captivating tales of love, conflict, and the human spirit, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might find it meaningful, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that makes you think, feel, and question. Thank you for watching, and remember, every tale holds a lesson, and every lesson makes us stronger.